So this event is dedicated to Jane Milton's edited book, Essential Reading from the Melanie Klein Archives, Original Papers and Critical Reflections. Jane Milton is Melanie's Klein archivist, and she is our guest today. Her book brings together a selection of unpublished material by Melanie Klein with contributions by a range of leading Klein scholars. We are here from the Tippul Net, the Israel Psychotherapy Net. We host the most exciting people in our field and give voice to the most original ideas. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Govrine. I am a psychoanalyst and a member of Tel Aviv Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis and a director of doctoral track Psychoanalysis and Hermeneutics at Bar Ilan University. Joining me is my colleague and good friend, Sharon Beyman. Hello, Sharon.
Hi, good evening. I am from the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yafo, where I had Mifrasim Institute for Psychotherapy Training and Research with focus on psychotherapy integration. And I'm very, very excited to be here tonight.
Thank you, Sharon. So we are all set to start. I will start with an excerpt from a short story, and I quote, "A friend has come, a young, merry, tempestuous chap. With a light touch, he wipes the sorrows of my brows. He touches my eyes. They become bright and shining. Then, in wanton joy, he laughs and showers me with flowers. He entices me to follow him. But when he's quite close to me, I get a fright. No longer he's the cheerful companion of fulfilled happy hours. He has returned a different man. In silence, he stands before me. Only his eyes are speaking. They pour into me fire and desire. And when he takes me by the hand, I feel with quivering that there will be a struggle between him and me. He forces me into his arms, and his lips are greedily seeking mine." End of quote. This is part of a short story which Melanie Klein wrote when she was 24. I picked it up from Melanie Klein's archive, which is digital and accessible to everyone. In this story and in other autobiographical material, you have a chance to meet a different Melanie Klein. Perhaps in this story, you can find the origin of her ideas of objects that can easily turn from good to seductive to persecutory. Here are some facts that I picked up from this fascinating book, from the autobiographical chapter she wrote, that you probably did not know about Melanie Klein. Did you know that her interest in children's minds goes back a very long way? Even as a child of 8 or 9, she was interested in watching younger children. Did you know that her mother had breastfed her 3 elder children, but Melanie, the youngest one, was fed by a nurse? Another interesting fact is that Klein had always been prone to spells of depression, including postnatal after each birth of her 3 children. And did you know that whereas her father was deeply in love with her mother and extremely jealous, her mother was not in love with him? I also discovered some new surprising views on her theory. Although Klein consistently considered the correct interpretation to be most effective means of reassurance, she occasionally also accepted a non-interpretation approach, as Claudia Frank reveals. Klein writes, I quote, "I take it that reassurance is an essential part of analysis," end of quote. Also, Klein did not accept the way Bion, Paula Heyman, and the young Kleinian generation used projective identification, as Hinchelwood reveals. She did not want analysts to be carried away by their transference. And another interesting fact, Klein intended to write a book on loneliness, as discovered by Jane Milton. Klein writes in a moving paragraph, and I quote, "All of us at times need solitude. It is not only because we have to think about something or do something, but because we need to be time to be by ourselves," end of quote. As you can see, this book tells us that Klein is often misunderstood and that on various topics, she had more nuanced opinions than those we thought she had. Allow me to introduce our guest today. Dr. Jane Milton is a psychiatrist and a training analyst of the British Psychoanalytical Society. Since 2014, she has been the archivist for the Melanie Klein Trust. She's one of the editor of the new dictionary of Kleinian thought, and she co-authored the book, A Short Introduction to Psychoanalysis. Good evening, Jane. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me. I feel so honored to be invited here. It was a wonderful surprise to get your original invitation. And I thought, gosh, how interesting that will be. So I've looked forward to this evening. Yes, I think Melanie Klein, that extract from the story she wrote when she was 24, I think it shows her sort of imagination and her passion. She was a very passionate woman, and she was very intense, I think, as well. And she inspired huge loyalty, but also inspired hostility as well. I think she was a sort of Marmite person. I don't know if you say this in Israel, but we say, oh, they're with Marmite, you know, that spread. You either love it or you hate it. It's that sort of thing. Yeah. And she was very, she was somebody who was, yes, very creative, very imaginative, a pioneer in many ways. Yeah, I mean, what would you like? Where would you like me to start?
Well, maybe can you tell us more about the archive?
Yes, well, it is interesting. The Melanie Klein archive. Well, let me start with the Melanie Klein Trust, which was set up in the mid 1950s while Melanie Klein was still alive, because there'd always been a fear that Klein's legacy would not be carried on. That there'd been a threat that in the 40s, she was almost expelled from the British Psychoanalytical Society for being a rebel, for being a nonconformist. So it was only 10 years later when the Melanie Klein Trust was set up to sort of preserve and expand her legacy. And when she died in 1960, all her papers, and it turned out she kept an enormous amount of clinical notes, jottings, thoughts, papers finished and unfinished, then lots of family material. So there was lots of clinical material, lots of family material, lots of ideas, a huge amount of paper, which ended up all stored in Hannah Siegel's house. I think it was in her wardrobes and her cupboards, and nobody knew quite what to do with all this paper until in 1984, it was all donated to the Wellcome Library, which is obviously a very a rich, benevolent foundation in London, where they've got a huge archive where they can keep precious papers like this in conditions of controlled temperature and humidity and keep them safe. And obviously, it's quite hard it was hard to access at first because you had to request them and you had to sit in the reading room and wear special gloves and so on. And then they were put onto microfiche, and then some of them were put onto CDs. But eventually, 2 years ago, I was one of the people who managed to get them digitized. Actually, almost the whole archive is now available publicly to the general public in digital form. And so anybody can access it, which is really very exciting. And it's so much easier now to work with. But I mean, I think it's 29, the original paper archive was like 29 big boxes each full of hundreds of papers. So you can imagine how much there was. The archivist for a long time was Elizabeth Botspilius, who died a few years ago, who, you remember, she's a psychoanalyst who's also an anthropologist. She was a very distinguished person in the British Society, and she looked after the archives and explored them, you know, for quite a long time, published various things. And then I took over in 2014 when she'd become too unwell to continue with the work. And it's been really exciting. It felt overwhelming at first because it's so big, and you think, well, where do I start with all this? And I suppose my thought was I just wanted to get as much as I could out there, unpublished stuff. And so I started writing a blog, which is to be found on the Melanie Klein Trust website. And then well, I mean, getting this book together was it's been one of my main tasks, really, to try and get some of her unpublished material out, and also work that's already exists, but scattered in different journals, some of them fairly obscure. And some of the chapters were only previously available in German, so they've been translated for the book. So it's a mixture, really, of work directly by Melanie Klein and work about her.
And since you start working at the archive and directing it,
here comes my cat. Sorry.
Did you change your mind about Klein? What surprises did you find in there that were unexpected?
Well, I suppose I was amazed and impressed by how much clinical material she recorded. It made me feel, oh my goodness, I don't make enough notes of my patients. And, you know, she was obviously very, very dedicated to her work. She comes across as very, very kind, very humane. There are some things you think, oh, she's banging on about something, about breasts and penises and this and that and the other. But in other ways, she's being very human, very warm with her patients. I've grown to really be very fond of her, but also be slightly frightened of her and slightly in awe of her as a very, very powerful lady. But there's always a surprise, and she can't stick to one. I mean, people complain about her for not being sort of I don't know. They say her theory is very It's very clinical. It's very clinical theory. She doesn't form meta theories about things. She just gets in there, and when she's writing about theory, within about half a page, she's already describing a case. And then she goes back to a bit of theory, and then another case comes in. She's all the time full of her cases, her patients, and that's what she's thinking about all the time. Her theory is sort of working, it's theory in action.
You know, Jane, they say that biographers often get fed up with their subjects with whom they have become over familiar. Is that true for archivists too?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not fed up with it yet, but I mean, my task at the moment, and some colleagues are helping me with this, is what to do with all this clinical material, because I feel something needs to be done, but obviously preserving respect and confidentiality for the patient she described, even though they're no longer alive. But it's yeah, there's a lot to be done, and I haven't got fed up with it yet.
Why that this material was unpublished?
Well, she was always giving lectures. She was invited to give a lot of lectures to educational establishments, social work, child guidance, and so on. And she'd go to different hospitals and clinics and give lectures. And some of them she would type up, or her secretary would type up for her, I think. Some of them she would handwrite. Sometimes they'd just be a skeleton. And I think she was always writing more than she published. And in fact, her sort of her collected works were published after her death. They were all the papers were brought together in 4 volumes, and a lot of stuff was left out. I think what's nice in the ones I published, these 4 lay lectures, I think are lovely, because when she writes for a lay audience, a non-psychoanalytic audience, she's much more accessible. I think sometimes her scientific so-called papers are very, very dense. I mean, English wasn't her first language, and possibly her writing would have sounded dense in German too, but it certainly can sound very dense and off-putting in English. But her lay lectures are much more free somehow. if she's speaking more freely. She's not speaking to colleagues she's trying to prove something to. She's talking to, you know, people outside the Institute of Psychoanalysis, which is always easier. I always find it easier myself. I find it easier speaking to all you than I would sitting in my own organization talking.
Yes, I was so surprised in her autobiographical chapter how she respected her Jewish heritage.
Very much so, yes. Yes, she wasn't religious. I think she didn't believe in God, for example. She did, but she very much respected her, very much was proud of her Jewish heritage. Her father came from a very, very Orthodox family, and the father's mother was apparently very, very upset that he wanted to study medicine, which he had to sort of prepare for secretly. And she apparently prayed that he wouldn't pass his exams, but he did, and he became a doctor. But the mother came from a relatively, well, they were also a religious family, but they were more liberal. And so I think she felt that her father had a harder time sort of doing what he wanted to do than the mother did.
And she moved between a lot of places. How do you find this frequent moves affected her biography and theory?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose her two different analyses, the one in Budapest with Ferenczi and the one in Berlin with Abraham, they were different but probably complemented each other. I mean, I don't think she was certainly unhappy in her marriage. She married the wrong man, really, and she sort of knew it but didn't know it, as she says in her autobiography. She over-respected his intellect and didn't quite realize that he wasn't really right for her. And so she moved around as he moved with his job. And for a while, she was living in a very small, very provincial village in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I can't remember what it was called, but she was very unhappy there. And so when she was able to move to Budapest, I think that was much more to her liking. And then another interesting thing about her, she spent a year in Slovakia in between Budapest and Berlin, which I hadn't realized, and she actually became fluent in Slovakian, which I think is incredible. She had a nanny for the children who was Slovakian, and so she mastered that, what must be quite a difficult language for a German speaker. I would have thought, a Slavic language like that. So
if I understand correctly, her three pregnancies were accompanied with depression?
Certainly the first two were. I'm not sure about the final one. Hang on a minute. I can't quite remember when Erich, the youngest son, was born, but she might have had a little bit of analysis by then. Or probably not. But yes, she did have a tendency to depression, and I think partly because, I would imagine, because she had some quite important early losses, including the loss of a much loved older sister who died of TB when the sister was 8 and she was 4, and then her older brother, who she very much idealized, who died of rheumatic heart disease when he was 25 and she was in her teens. Yeah, and then I think she felt rather unloved and overlooked by her father too, which I think was a source of sorrow for her. The father openly favored one of the other children.
Do you sometimes tempted to analyze her theory according to her autobiography and what you know about her early life? I mean, how did she get to these ideas of the depressive and schizoparanoid position when considering her early life?
Yeah.
Do you sometimes play with that?
Well, I think she was very self-analytical, because do you remember in her paper, it's one of her morning papers, when she talks very movingly about Mrs. A, who's lost her son. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's herself she's talking about, and she's talking about her own process of mourning, and a manic phase and a despairing phase, and a phase when she turns away from death back to life again. And Mrs. A is Mrs. Klein, in fact. so I think she is very self-analytical, and I think she uses tragedy and loss to in a very creative way, in what she would call a reparative way, because she feels that what we have to do about the bad things that happen to us and our own destructiveness and our own hatefulness, we have to strive to repair the damage we've done and the damage that's been done, and that is what creativity springs from. And I think she herself was somebody who was able to repair things inside her and outside her.
Yes. You told us that the chapter on play is one of your favorites.
I like the chapter on play because I think I think one of the things, I don't know how many of you sort of, there's a common misconception about Klein in that she was only interested in the inner world and not the outer world. But I think the play chapter shows how, for her, the two are absolutely inextricable, that they work together, because her idea that we don't start off as a tabula rasa, we start off as a little being full of all sorts of rather terrifying approximations to reality, very good figures, very bad figures, doing terrible things to us, first of all to do with the mouth and eating and biting and so on, through the sort of Freudian phases, so to speak. But we're all the time projecting this sort of inner template, this first approximation to reality. We're all the time projecting that out and then taking back in a modified form of it, because we find the world isn't quite how we saw it. So we take in a new form and then we project and introject. You go on projecting and re-introjecting until, all being well, internal reality becomes a little bit closer to the external reality than it was at first. And I think she says that in play, a normal, uninhibited child is doing just that. They're reality testing. They're sort of they're demonstrating their terrifying or exciting fantasies, but they're also, manipulating reality, and they're getting feedback from reality. There's a quote from the chapter on play: mental stability and wealth of personality depend largely on a good interplay between the unconscious and the conscious mind, between the individual's fantasy life and his relation to reality. And there's another bit that sort of shows how she thinks about internal and external reality. Here we are again. This is on page 19 of play. In play, the actual life of the child, with all his experiences, great and small, everyday and unusual, find expression. But also his past experiences from the earliest days onwards are represented. Thus, the child's play is a bridge between fantasy and reality, because he gives expression to both side by side, and because he can represent in play the interplay between experiences, past and present, and his fantasy life. For the child's fantasies from the earliest stage of development onwards influence his perceptions of reality, and on the other hand, his experiences influence his fantasies, and thus there is a constant interplay between experiences and fantasies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she didn't avoid making interpretation, even with body and parts of bodies to children, right? And that was a very pioneer thing at her time, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, she always instinctively, she always talked about going for the point of anxiety. And if the child was very, very inhibited in the playroom, but was doing some little action with the toys, and she would try and work out what are they trying to represent. And if she got it right, if her guess was right, the child would start to play more. First of all, the child would be a bit scared, but then they'd relax and play a bit more freely. It's like she talks, I don't know if you know the book Clinical Klein by Robert Hinchelwood. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful it's a wonderful sort of description of sort of how she uses play to sort of how she uses interpretations to test hypotheses, and how the child's reaction to her rather frightening interpretations can sometimes confirm, or whether she's right or not. A little very inhibited little boy starts knocking two horses together, and then he says, I've got a baby brother, and she says something like, perhaps those are two people banging together. And she says, the little boy says, that's not nice. And then he starts doing it a bit more, and he explores a bit more about what they're doing, these creatures, and she gradually starts to bring out of him the fact that he's actually quite worried about what his parents do in bed, and how his little brother came to be, and that he's worried that he's actually wants to harm his little brother, and then his little brother had an accident and that frightened him, and she sort of gradually brings it out, and she's saying very terrifying things about what he's imagining, and he says, ooh, that's not nice, but then he starts to relax and play more freely and tell her more, and so she feels, I got to the anxiety there. I sort of hit the nail on the head somehow. I identified what he was really frightened of, and what he thought he'd done to the parents and the little brother, and what he thought the parents were doing to each other, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yes, but yes, you're wrong.
The chapter on play, can you help us to understand how it shed light about the interplay between symbolization and play in mental life? Because interpretation is more the symbolization, and the actual play is experiencing the thing. So how these two working together?
Well, play can be symbolic to different degrees, can't it? Sometimes children are so unable to symbolize. They just, like the little boy Dick in Klein's symbol paper, he couldn't symbolize at all. He just hid behind the door when Klein came near. But whereas children, when the little boy who was knocking the two horses together was symbolizing the parental intercourse in a little bit more, quite a concrete way, but there was a bit of symbolization involved. And there's another little boy she talks about in the play chapter who he's inhibited at school. He's very inhibited with learning, and let me try and find it. This is the little boy who he can't write, in German, where you often get a double S in words. He would always misspell it and only put a single S. And it turned out through, talking to him and listening to him and playing with him, that he was actually, the two S's represented him and his father, and that the pen represented a penis, and the paper he was writing on represented as if he was imagining he was in a boat on the water, and the water representing the mother, the mother lake, and that he sort of wanted to take mother away from father, and so he had to separate the two S's, but at the same time he was very frightened about what he'd done, because he felt he'd castrated father. But once Klein was able to talk to him about all that, his learning became very freed up. I'm not sure if I'm quite answering your question properly, but it was my association anyway.
But that was very controversial, no? How she talked like that to children, wasn't it?
It was very controversial. Her sort of direct rival, if you like, or the person who became, I don't suppose either of them intended to become rivals, but Anna Freud took a very different approach. For example, she would say, well, you mustn't talk to children about these things. They're still under the care of their parents. They don't yet form a transference. You've got to be very careful. You've got to be very gentle and reassuring, and you've got to try and make them trust you before you start. And you must be very, very careful not to interpret anything too, frightening. So she took a sort of much more gentle educational approach, whereas Klein did the exact opposite. She just waded in and tried to find out what the anxiety was. And it was very controversial. People would say, that's appalling. You can't talk to children about penises and mummy and daddy banging their genitals together. That's appalling to say that to children. But as of course earlier on people had said to Freud, it's appalling to talk about childhood sexuality. You're positively indecent to say such things exist.
Yes. Well, we have a question from Dodi Goldman who writes like this: interplay is a word Winnicott often used. Could you say more about her relationship with Donald Winnicott, and if anything new has emerged from the unpublished material of these relationships?
Well, there's certainly in the chapter on loneliness, she quotes from Donald Winnicott's paper on the capacity to be alone. So I think she admired that paper and sort of used it in her thinking. I mean, there was a rather sort of sadly difficult relationship between the two of them. I think Winnicott felt that he developed Klein's ideas in a particular direction, and he came to really disagree with Klein about a lot of things, and I think he felt he wasn't sufficiently recognized by her, and that you had to either, he felt the fact that he didn't agree with her and had different ways of seeing things wasn't respected, and I think he became really very sad about that. There were all sorts of fallings out in the psychoanalytic world at that time. I think that there were such pressures on everybody. I mean, the horror of the war and the sort of all the coming together of people from different countries, and I think everybody was in a very heightened state of emotion and conflict. And I think there were some very sad fallings out, as there still are, of course, in all psychoanalytics, all psychotherapy and psychoanalytic societies. But yeah, I think probably Winnicott had a more, I don't know, I'm not quite sure if I'm right about this, but you know how Freud says in one of his papers, hate is older than love. The ego only sort of, gets in touch with reality because it has to. And Barlind, I'm not sure about Winnicott, but Barlind would say, love is older than hate, because the first relationship with the mother is lovely, it's loving. It's only when frustration comes in that hate appears. And I think Winnicott might be more along the same lines as Barlind, in that he would sort of see love as primary, just as Freud saw hate as earlier than love. Whereas I think Klein saw them absolutely there together at the beginning, clashing with each other. There were destructive parts, there were loving parts, and they were there from the word go. And I think Winnicott was I think he moved a little bit away from seeing it in quite that way, although I'm not an expert on Winnicott, and if I had a Winnicott scholar here, I'm sure she or he would say that's not quite right. But yeah.
But from what you learned from the archives, did they discuss these gaps or this debate?
I haven't yet found specific. I found a rather sad letter from Winnicott, which I think is known. I think it's already published somewhere, saying, I wish you would understand what I'm trying to say to you. I wish you would accept what I'm. It is rather a sort of a rather desperate letter from Winnicott to Klein, but we don't have the reply. She kept very little of her professional correspondence, which is very sad. She obviously must have deliberately destroyed it, because her family correspondence is all there, but her professional correspondence mostly isn't. No, I haven't yet. I mean, I'll be very interested when I do come across something that directly sort of connects with Winnicott, when she directly addresses him. I'm sure she does somewhere, but I haven't yet. I mean, I really feel I've touched the surface of the archive so far.
Yes. I think Winnicott was frustrated that she hadn't mentioned him enough.
Yes.
He did say so. We have another question from Esther Cohen. She asks if you can elaborate on her attitude, on Klein's attitude toward parents and removing them from child therapy. And she asks, is it related to her biography?
How do you mean removing them from the child's?
I mean, they're not part of the therapy, are they?
Well, Klein herself, actually, if you look at some of her child archives, some of which are actually still restricted, they're not digitized yet because the children would be in their 90s now. So some of it, I mean, there are often letters from the parents. So she sort of she would keep in touch with parents about their children's progress, and there would be some interaction. I mean, I think you're right that in the Kleinian model of child psychotherapy, as it's practiced at the TAVI, for example, a different therapist would see the parents. That the therapist would want to protect a private space for the child, so the child didn't feel that he or she was being discussed all the time. So the child knew that what they said would stay in the room and wouldn't go back to mum or dad. So yes, there's a separation in that sense. But I think most Kleinian-oriented child therapists would meet with the parent maybe once a term or something like that. And the child would be told that was going to happen, and they'd have all sorts of fantasies about it and so on. But is that what you meant, Sharon, or were you thinking of?
Yeah, I think that the question was asked as in comparison to more dyadic approaches, where children and parents are treated as a unit.
Yes, what do you mean, more family therapy sort of?
It's just family, but also like dyadic. It's the dyad between the parents and the dyad is the patient. We are aiming to the dyad and also treating the parents. But I saw from the biography that she was in a close relationship with parents, the parents of Dick and others.
She was, but I think what was most important to her was the inner world of the individual child. I think, she felt that their relationships with the parents obviously were important, but what she was focusing on was their inner representations of, their inner parents, which might be very, very different from their outer parents.
And from and as you see it, the Kleinians in London or elsewhere nowadays work the same?
I think Kleinians in London probably, certainly adult analysts talk less about body parts than Klein did, but child analysts, child therapists probably do a little bit more still, especially those trained in the Meltzer and Matty Harris tradition at the Tavistock Clinic. It does, I think it's variable. There's a bit of a spectrum, I'd say. But I mean, just to take up the point about the real parents in the room with the child, I think, you see, Klein would say that children have transferences to their parents, just as they do to everybody else, that we all have transferences to our parents. We all don't know our parents. We get to know them gradually. And so, having the real parent in the room would sort of not help in that way, because the child would feel, well, they wouldn't be seeing the mother the way the therapist was seeing the mother.
Yeah.
We have another question from Chris Mawson.
Oh yes, I saw Chris had been putting his name up.
He writes, what we do not get from the text is Melanie's musical and expressive voice. Yours is similarly musical, actually. In spite of Melanie Klein's disapproval of some of Paula Heyman's ideas, her reference to, quote, freely mobile emotional sensibility, end of quote, is important. What is your view on this, Jane? The freely mobile emotional sensibility.
It's an interesting point. I think she was a very emotional person. I think she was very warm. As I said, she was warm, she was passionate, she was tuned into people, she was intensely interested in people. And I think, it's this thing about countertransference, although she disapproved of this newfangled idea about countertransference. Actually, she was probably using it all the time, because she was feeling things, she was feeling people. I believe she had, I believe she did like music, and she had, in fact, a famous harpsichordist called, what was she called? name's gone out of my head, playing at her funeral apparently, but she, yes. I mean, she did, if you want to hear her voice, go onto the Melanie Klein Trust website. If you just put Melanie Klein Trust into Google or whatever search engine, you'll get onto the Melanie Klein Trust website, and there you can hear a little extract of her voice. I mean, she had a very heavy accent to the end of her life. Sometimes people find it quite hard to follow her speech, but it was a very warm sort of musical voice. Yeah.
It doesn't always pass in her clinical cases, is it? She doesn't seem warm. She seems dry and technical.
I think she does in some of her it's like I was saying, the difference between her lectures, the lectures she wrote for the public and the lectures she wrote for her colleagues. I think in the lectures she wrote for her colleagues, she seemed to be much stiffer and very, very condensed. I mean, she would sort of condense the most complicated things into a paragraph, and you look at it and you have to try and sort of unpick it and unpack it and think, what does she mean? How could she possibly have said all that to the patient in one go? And I don't think she probably did. I think she sort of compresses her interpretations when she describes them, and she compresses her ideas. Yeah, it can be indigestible. I think people can read things like Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms, which is a very great paper and a very important paper, but they can be put off by the sheer sort of weight and density of it, and think, oh no, I can't cope with Melanie Klein. I mean, that's why I was glad to be able to bring these lectures out, because I think, I mean, I don't know what you all think, but I feel that anybody who's read them yet, I feel that they are much more accessible, and you can see how she's thinking.
Jane, speaking about warmth, some of the audience asked Edith and the others, our personal experience as a daughter and later as a mother, and their complicated relationship with her daughter Melissa, in comparison to a warm relationship with her son Eric and the death of her son Hans. How do you think, learning from your perspective as learning so much about her, our personal experience as mother influenced her theory and ideas on parenting?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure she wasn't as sort of good a mother as she would have wanted to be. I think when she was a young woman, she was very unhappy. She was in an unhappy marriage. She was often depressed. She went off to sanatoria for cures and so on. And I think at that time, people just didn't realize, it was pre the Robertsons, of course, and people didn't realize in the 20s and 30s that separation from children really does damage them a lot, early separations. And I think her daughter, her oldest child in particular, had I mean, this is I'm just sort of guessing here, that this would have affected Melita a lot. And probably the divorce of the parents, where Melita, first of all, was with her father rather than her mother. I think, it sounds to me as if Melita was as strong a character as her mother. You know, they were both very, very strong women, and they probably just, you know, clashed so much and weren't, and it's so sad that it wasn't able to be repaired. I think Melita's analyst, Edward Glover, didn't help, and he was very critical of Klein, and I think he let his feelings about, I mean, this is where it's, you know, one has to be so careful analyzing children of colleagues, because you have to be so careful not to influence the patient and be influenced by the patient, and it's almost impossible. But I think it was probably not.
Do you believe Glover had influenced Melissa?
Well, he was her analyst, and it was during her analysis with him that she became so hostile to her mother. So I think rather than helping her to come to terms with her difficulties with her mother and to sort of mourn the mother she might have had and repair her internal mother and, you know, have a bit of a rapprochement with her external mother, I mean, he probably just sort of redoubled her hatred of her mother, really.
I think it's Melita joined Anna Freud's camp in the controversies, and she was a fierce opponent to her mother publicly. So I guess the clash between them was very severe.
Yes, she was a very fierce opponent publicly, and I think people used to, Klein herself apparently would just keep silent, but which probably annoyed Melita even more. She wouldn't even fight back in public, but Melita used to say very cruel, well, you know, very outspoken things against her in public, in scientific meetings, and I think people, the whole society found it very difficult. Yeah, I'm not sure if she was in Anna Freud's camp or whether she was more aligned with a sort of the middle group. I'm not sure actually, but she certainly was anti. Although she started off quite aligned with her mother's views at first, but she did. It's difficult to know whether it was her ideas or her person that she was objecting to. These things are always complicated.
Robin always asked, I will read the question, what about her relationship with Beyond, who complained about his analysis with her, that she failed to understand how he died at the Battle of Ypres?
How he died? In symbolically?
Symbolically, yeah.
I hadn't read that. Yeah, I mean, all analysts fail to understand some things about their patients. I'm you know, I think that I think he certainly learned a lot from Klein, but then developed things in his own way and became an enormous thinker in his own right. And he developed, for instance, he developed her notion of projective identification in a very major way. He made all sorts of major contributions. Yeah. But I'm sure, like all of us, he felt that he was in some ways misunderstood by his analyst. His analyst could have done better.
And the chapter of the book is dedicated to counter-transference. And you mentioned that just before, but that she did not accept the view that the analyst can use projective identification, you know, to feel what the patient's unconscious feel by himself, right? She rejected this idea.
Oh, is it the analyst using projective identification?
Yes.
You mean
yes.
well, I suppose in its most benign form, projective identification is sort of the basis of empathy, isn't it? But that's a sort of conscious projective identification. It's a sort of almost consciously putting yourself in the place of the patient. But projective identification is normally an unconscious mechanism, of course. You don't know you've projected, you just see the other person as bad or very good or whatever.
Yes, but the young generation said that projective identification is an interaction thing between the analyst and the patient. And she didn't like that view. She didn't like the fact that the analyst will be that the patient will have too much impact on the analyst.
Well, I think what she, I mean, her concept of projective identification, as she originally stated it, was an unconscious fantasy on the part of the baby projects bad things into the mother and sees the mother as bad. So the whole thing's happening in the baby's mind. But of course, her followers, especially Beyond, developed the concept. And it's to say, yeah, it can be just an unconscious mechanism on the part of the patient, or it can be a mechanism that is actually actualized because the projection actually has an effect on the recipient of the projection. And then you've got a basis of communication, countertransference, and so on. I think she probably, I mean, it's interesting in her much later work, it's as if she sort of, she accepts that to an extent, that development of her work, but she hasn't quite caught up with it because she's still worried about people saying, oh, the patient projected this or that into me, and so I felt this or that. And she's saying, you know, it's the famous time when a student in a seminar said to her, oh, Mrs. Klein, the patient projected his confusion into me at this point. And she said, no, dear, you're confused. You know, she said, you don't blame everything on the patient. It's coming from you. You need to go and analyze it. But yes, I think, I mean, she didn't go as far as her followers went. I mean, they developed her idea of they took it and ran with it, and projective identification became a multifaceted and very, very interesting concept. She sort of started the ball rolling, really.
Yes. We have another question from Ophir Partok. He asked, what was her approach to trauma?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, because on the whole, she is sort of, I mean, I suppose in a lot of her writing, she's talking as if the child has a good enough, what Winnicott would call a good enough mother. So this is what happens with a child with a good enough mother, and this is, you know. But actually, of course, many mothers and fathers aren't good enough. They're traumatizing. They project into the child. And although she doesn't theorize trauma a lot. It's not her particular preoccupation. Her particular preoccupation is the inner world and the fantasies that. But what she does say, oh, I've got it somewhere. I've only got one arm, so one working arm, so I can't find all my references.
Okay.
But there's where is it? There's one point anyway where she says that the environment can be very comforting because the child projects something horrible, and the environment shows that it's not as horrible as that, and so the child is comforted. But the environment, she does say, I've got a good quote somewhere which I can't at the moment lay my hands on, but she does, in one passage at least that I've got here, say that, but the environment may confirm his worst fears, that he ends up feeling just as persecuted, if not more so, because the response of the parents is not at all reassuring, or it doesn't mitigate the fantasy. So in that sense, she's talking, but she's not, she doesn't sort of write papers on trauma. It's not her particular bag. It's not her particular thing that she writes about, others do, but she's more interested in sort of exploring other things. It's not that she ignores the trauma.
To expand this question, just she experienced severe traumas during her childhood, losing her sister, and afterwards a lot of moves from place to place, and her depressions and so. And then when she came to London, the war, and she treated children during the war. Yeah. So how she related in continuance to Anura's question, how she related to the bad objects in the real bad events or bad objects in the world in relation to the project.
Well, I mean, in fact, in that respect, the chapter by Claudia Frank called, where is it? Let me find the actual title of it. Chapter 6, on Melanie Klein's contemporaneous references to Hitler and the Second World War in her therapeutic sessions. And I think there's a lot of material Claudia Frank has turned up, as well as material that already appears in the Richard analysis, where Klein is very, very deeply aware of what's going on in the outside world and the horrors that are going on. But she's also interested in how the patient is sometimes, that the bad Hitler outside evokes a terrible sort of Hitler father inside, which sometimes the patient even identifies with. And the patient himself or herself can have a savage, destructive fantasies. But she's showing how inner and outer work so much together, how real trauma out there sort of resonates with stuff going on inside, destructive things, fearful fantasies, and so on. So she's sort of, I mean, I think it's not that she's not interested in trauma, she's very interested in what the individual mind does with trauma, and how pre-existing internal horrors can sort of either mitigate or, how it can be exacerbated or mitigated by the state of the internal world. Because she sees the sort of a solid, good ego inside as being based on internalizing loving and sort of stable parents. And so that if you haven't got that, you don't have a sort of stable ego, your ego is split or fragmented or shattered, and so you can't deal later on with trauma. I mean, I think people built on her work to thinking more from the trauma, looking at trauma more than, in a different way than she did.
There is a chapter 4 on the sadness and loss in the emotional life of the young child.
Yes.
You edited. Can you share what is the main innovating ideas in this chapter?
Well, I think it sort of links with her idea, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, of the depressive position, that in the very early months, she sort of hypothesizes the infant to have a very split view of the world. One moment he's with the good mother, the next moment he's with the bad mother, and they're different mothers. But as he begins to realize that actually it's the same person, and that he's felt angry and hateful and wanted to bite and kill and hurt the bad mother, that he's actually been wanting to do that to the good mother because they're the same person. And so there's what she calls the dawning of the depressive position, the feeling, oh no, I've done something terrible to my loved mother, my loved father. And so it's almost as if depression, sort of sadness and guilt particularly, is built into the psyche from very early on. And if your worst fear is confirmed and your mother dies when you're quite small, you're inevitably going to feel in some way responsible for that. And it's because of if you're bound to have ordinary destructive as well as reparative fantasies. And she also talks about the importance of reparation, the importance of trying to repair your inner world, of trying to make up for the attacks you've made in fantasy. And she's saying that all adults, and I think this is very true, we don't like to think of children as unhappy, and mothers particularly don't like to think of their children as unhappy, and children know this, and children will often reassure their parents that they're all right really, or they're better now, all gone, all better, and actually they might be feeling awful inside, and that children suffer a lot more than most people think they do, even ordinary children in ordinary kindly families. And so I think she's sort of stressing that and saying that almost, and also that sadness and guilt is she also says it's a part of love, because the other thing Klein talks a lot about is love, in fact. I mean, she talks about hate, she talks about destructiveness, but she also talks a lot about love, and how love is inevitably accompanied by guilt and fear of loss and sadness. It's sort of inextricably mixed, so that in a way, life is hard. You can't avoid suffering, and unless you're actually psychotic, you can't avoid sadness and guilt and mourning. It's sort of part of the fabric of the mind, the fabric of life. And it's you don't have to be a traumatized child. You just have to be an ordinary child going through an ordinary life to have to bear sadness and guilt and loss.
Another lecture that is included in the book is the importance of the unconscious mind for the whole personality. Can you share the contribution of this paper?
Yeah, that isn't one I've read in the last few days, so I'm trying to Oh, yes, actually, no, I did look at this example earlier on. She's sort of really, she's talking about how you can't, she's saying the sort of thing that Freud did, but she's expanding it, that you can't help giving away your unconscious all the time. It's like this, she talks about this 15-year-old boy, and he met her for the first time. He'd been sent to see her for some certain problems he had, and she'd asked him about his difficulties, and then she gave him a long explanation. I gave an explanation of the purpose of the treatment and mentioned that by means of psychoanalysis, I might find the unconscious reasons for his difficulties and thus be able to relieve them. He had listened politely and with interest, went on to talk about himself, and then he said, just a free association, that he'd been at a fun fair the day before. He was very amused about the showman there, who'd been proclaiming how marvelous his show was. And so immediately, quite unconsciously, the boy is saying, well, I'm not so sure about all this stuff about psychoanalysis being so wonderful, but, you know, you're being a bit of a showman. And she spots this and says, I think you're saying that about me. So she makes a very early transference interpretation. And he says, well, yes, actually, I have a lot of doubts about whether this is going to be any good. You know, so he, so she goes right in there with a transference interpretation in the first meeting, which again is something that certainly Anna Freud wouldn't have done. And that she goes straight for what she thinks is the anxiety and what's really bothering the child, in this case, a teenager. Hang on. I've got the wrong glasses on now. Yes, that's right. She makes an interesting comment in that particular chapter. If repression is overstrong.
Jane, can you do it a little bit more louder?
I'm sorry, yes. Yeah, she's talking, when she talks about the conscious, therefore, if repressions be overstrong, they're liable to disturb the mental balance. Just as, to take an example from the field of politics, subterranean activities are more likely to overthrow the regime than those which are allowed free expression. So it's down there, the unconscious is you know, she's saying what Freud said really, but in a different words. She's got a lot of respect for the unconscious.
Jane, I read that feminists really loved Klein because she didn't put too much emphasis on the real mother, too much weight on the real mother. She didn't blame mothers on their children's unhappiness. And they disliked Winnicott and Bowlby, who put too much emphasis and blamed mothers for all the pathological situations of their children. What do you think of that?
Well, it's I think it's like psychoanalytic theorizing tends to go in waves, doesn't it? Sort of, you know, somebody will talk about the environment and the next person will talk about the inner world and then the environment will come back. You know, it's sort of, I mean, I think that's right. You can get into patient blaming, you can get into mother blaming, can't you? You can say, I mean, I think sometimes people become caricatures of their so-called analytic group and they can become very patient blaming. It's all the patient's envy and destructiveness, or it's all the mother's fault. You know, you can, and of course both of those are absolutely, it's a false dichotomy. You shouldn't be blaming either. You should be trying to understand the complex interaction. But I think that's right, because she didn't emphasize trauma in the way that Winnicott did. I think often people's followers become more sort of fanatical than the original people. Klein got very fed up because oh, actually I do know where this quote is because it's one of my favorite quotes. It comes from John Steiner's lectures on technique that he published. She says, where is it now? She's talking about the tendency to blame everything on the patient. And this is in 1958, she says this in a seminar. There was a time when I felt very badly because my work on bringing out the importance of aggression led some analysts to behave as if they could see nothing but aggression. I was quite in despair. All I heard in seminars and at meetings of the society was aggression, aggression, and aggression. Now you cannot do anything with all that, because the point is that aggression can only be tolerated when it is modified and mitigated. And this happens when you have brought out the capacity for love. And she's very much wanting to bring out the capacity for love hidden beneath the hatred. She comes back to this quite a lot. But I think, you know, some of her followers have, I think especially when people are starting out and they're getting very enthusiastic about I don't know, envy or the death instinct or something, they start seeing it all over the place. But you know, as you grow older and wiser, you perhaps become a bit more nuanced about it, just as I think Klein was. But yes, indeed, I mean, it's you can't blame the patient or the mother. It's a complex interaction, isn't it?
The quote you just read was really the unfamiliar Klein, I think. Why do you think Klein had that reputation that is not true to her real character?
It's not at all. I think the trouble is, Klein had a lot of very zealous followers who were overzealous about, I mean, it's a very powerful idea, the idea of constitutional envy and innate destructiveness. It's very powerful. And of course, people are going to be very interested in it. But I think, you know, I suppose in her very early writing, she was very interested in the sort of the early sadistic phases when there's this sort of fantasy of wanting to get inside the mother's body and rob the mother and get in there. And as her writing matured, she became much more writing about love as much as hate. And after all, her little chapter on envy, her paper on envy is called Envy and Gratitude. It's about a balance. It's about a dialectic sort of within the personality. I mean, the other thing about, sorry, suddenly had a thought about feminism as well. I think the other thing is that it wasn't just that she didn't blame the mothers. I think she said, hang on a minute, a little girl isn't just a little boy with a bit chopped off. A little girl has an internal world, and she has a fantasy of babies inside, babies she might grow inside, and something that she has to protect inside, and something very special inside. Okay, she doesn't have a penis, but she's got a lot of other stuff, and she's also very interested in inside of the mother's body, just as the little boy is. I mean, in a way, she sort of she sort of rather enlightened this dark continent of female sexuality that Freud talked about. She said, actually, I can tell you quite a bit about that. It's not so dark, but it's very mysterious. It's very internal, and that the mother's is every bit as important as the father. In fact, she might have, some people say she rather underemphasized the father. I don't know if that's true, but she certainly was very interested in mothers and the internal world of the mother.
Jane, we have a few questions from the audience, but before I would like to ask you, I understand that her dream was to be a physician.
Yes.
And she has to give this dream, to give up this dream because she got married and had children at an early age. But actually, she didn't went, if I understand correctly, through any formal professional studies.
That's absolutely right. I mean, during her long engagement, which was 4 or 5 years, she did do courses at the university in Vienna, but they were sort of more arts and sciences. They were sort of...
So from the autobiographical aspect, which is very meaningful in the book, how this aspect of not having formal degree, formal profession, how it influenced her career, a relationship with other analysts, her professional fights, her theory?
It must have made a difference. I mean, that she didn't have an actual profession. I mean, it must have meant she had to fight a bit harder for recognition, and she may possibly have been aware of not having had a core profession in the sense of being a doctor or a teacher or whatever. But I think she was like a sponge for knowledge. I think she just read and read and read and just gathered all she could. And she was very hungry for education from an early age. I mean, the older sister who died taught her to read when she was 4 and things like that. Taught her. She's very hungry and very sort of avid student at school. I think she worked very hard and did very well at school. But yeah, but the financial circumstances in the end didn't allow her to study.
Was she confronted? In London with this issue of education or?
Do you know? I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure the answer is known. It's probably in Grosskreutz somewhere, but I couldn't say offhand. But I can imagine people would have said, they would have, people who didn't like her would have, I'm sure, would have commented on the fact that she had, didn't have a proper professional education. I'm sure that would have occurred. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Yeah.
Okay, and there is a question, if Melanie in her late years was asked what she herself regard as her most important contribution to understanding and improving the human condition, what would she answer, to your opinion?
I think she'd say probably have a development of the play technique to allow children to express themselves and the understanding of the child. I mean, one of the ideas that she very much sort of liked was her idea of a paranoid defense against depression, which I think is very familiar to all of us, that if you start to feel a little bit worried or guilty, to sort of snap back into a defensiveness and a blaming. It's such a ready shift from depressive position back into paranoid schizoid position, and she saw that as absolutely ubiquitous, and I mean, and of course it's very important for the whole of human life, isn't it? Global politics and everything, the way we sort of, it's hard to really see who you are and where you are and what you've done, and it's easy to become defensive, it's easy to project and to split, and it's sort of it's human nature. But I think she saw that as the paranoid defense against depression, I think she saw as an important discovery. I think she felt she had contributed something. She was surprised to find as the years went by, because it just seemed an obvious way to work with children to her at first, and then she realized it was different from how other people worked.
Maybe we can talk something about the loneliness chapter, which you wrote about in your book. It seems an extraordinary paper of her, both brilliant and moving. And she speaks there openly about her deepest experiences of grief, depression, and loneliness.
Yes. It sort of does feel as if she's speaking about herself, doesn't it? I mean, she doesn't openly say, I'm speaking about myself, but it must be. She must be speaking from experience, as well as experience of her patients, of course, and this idea of what you really need is an intact, harmonious inner world. And that'll sort of see you through, but that inevitably your inner world can't be harmonious. Inevitably there are some things that are split off, there are some things you can't contact, there are I mean, I think it's interesting that the paper that was originally published was published after her death, and it hadn't been fully worked through, and the extra notes that I found in the archive sort of do expand it. And it was interesting how she was integrating the ideas of her colleagues as well. How she was collecting thoughts from, Elliot Jacques and Wilfred Bion and Winnicott and Hannah Siegel. Rosenfeld also commented on the paper that she was sort of, as if she was trying to bring a whole lot of things together.
It seems such a tragic paper, Winnicott also wrote about loneliness, but his paper was much more optimistic than her. She seems very tragic, with sadness and nostalgia and longing.
Well, is it tragic, or is it just sort of describing the human condition, really? I mean, she's talking about. I think
there are different kinds of loneliness she relates to.
Yeah, I mean, she talks about a sort of much more paranoid sort of loneliness, where you're feeling surrounded by persecutors and you're alone because everybody's against you and you're on your own. And then the more depressive sort of loneliness where you grieve for the things that you haven't had or that you've lost and you'll never regain. And I think it's interesting that she's talking about people who come to terms with aging badly or well, isn't she? Or people who die with some sort of feeling of completion or some sort of harmony, inner harmony, and people who die in fear. Because she talks in her autobiography about the difference between the death of her mother and her sister in that way, doesn't she? That she felt her mother's last days and last hours were relatively tranquil, whereas her sister was frightened to the last, sort of thing, which was, and I think she sort of, one gets the feeling that Klein is feeling she hopes she's more like her mother in that respect, and probably is.
I wonder what you say about the following paragraph that I found in Phyllis Grothker's biography on Klein. She wrote about this paper, Phyllis Grothker. She wrote, Klein's paper is tragic threaded with a longing for harmony that can never be achieved. The word seems to flow from some deep well of sadness, nostalgia, and longing. In some of the photographs taken of Klein during these last years, she has an expression of a lost child. Would you agree to this?
It's an interesting comment. I think she would say that that was sort of just normal for human beings to never really, to always have a longing for some lost state. It's almost like it is. I mean, it's like Wordsworth says about oh, I can't remember how he puts it now, but it's that same thing about oh, it's gone out of my head, but you know what I mean, don't you? I think probably sort of the feeling that you almost sort of, you can't escape a feeling of longing and nostalgia, something that you've perhaps never had and probably haven't ever had, but that we never feel complete. That it is part of it. If we think we were complete, we're in a state of omnipotence, really.
And she also speaks about audible loneliness.
Yes. And she's very preoccupied with integration of the male and female parts of the personality and how difficult that is. And one feels that must have been something about her that she felt she hadn't properly integrated mother and father or male and female parts of herself. Because she goes on and on about it in the archive. There's pages of it. She's trying to get hold of something that she can't quite identify. I'm sorry to interrupt what you're saying, but I don't want to because I don't want to not say something which you might be interested in. Did you know that she had actually, well, one cause of sadness, great sadness for her, I think, is that she fell really in love with a man just after around the time of her divorce, called Klötzl. Where have I written this? Oh, I've lost a bit of paper now. Here he's called Czeskel Zvi Klötzl, who she met in Berlin at a dancing class. And I think they had a passionate affair by the sound of it. I mean, the letters were actually published in the Groskopf biography. But did you know that he ended up being the features editor of the Jerusalem Post?
No.
No.
What did you find about their love relationship in the archive? What did you find there about their love?
Well, all I found about their relationship in the archive is their letters, the letters, or his letters. You know, both sides. But in fact, when I looked, I realised that the letters are actually published in Groskopf, so that it's not a new find. So I'm really not saying anything new, but and Groskopf is actually, I think, a bit dismissive and saying, "Oh, silly woman, you fancy falling head over heels like that. She should have been more sensible." But I think she really did feel he was the love of her life, but actually he was a bit of a serial, adulterer. He felt as soon as he went off, he traveled from country to country. He was a journalist, and he kept falling in love with women and then dropping them, and she was just sadly one in a line of those, I think. But I don't think she ever really. I think she felt he was her true love. But he did then emigrate in 1933. Groskopf said he emigrated to Palestine. I don't know whether that means he went straight to Jerusalem, but he then became features editor of the Jerusalem Post. So, but he then died in I think the 50s sometime.
Well, she certainly didn't follow him to Israel, did she?
She didn't, no.
But she said she admired Zionism, although she writes in her autobiography she admired Zionism, but she said that she hate the idea of living in Israel.
She says she admires. There's one very interesting bit actually, where she says how much she admires. Here we are. This is in her autobiography. In my attitude of sympathy with Israel also enters a feeling which, though it may have originated in the state of persecution of the Jews, extends to all minorities and to all people persecuted by stronger forces. Who knows? This might have given me strength to be always in a minority about my scientific work, and not to mind, and to be quite willing to stand up against a majority for which I had some contempt, which in time has been mitigated by tolerance. So she's sort of quite identified with them.
Yeah. I think Freud said similar things about his Jewishness being a minority and psychoanalysis being a minority.
Yeah.
In this relation, there was a question from the audience before, I don't find it right now, about was in the Israeli, in the Jewish, there is a Jewish idea about good drive and bad drive, Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara. It's a very basic idea in Judaism that, and was she aware of the parallel of the ideas between the ideas of good object and bad object? And
sorry, I didn't catch the first thing you said. The difference between good what and bad what was the word you used?
How do you say it? And Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara?
The good, there is like a good drive that, pushes the
drive. Sorry, yes, I didn't catch the word.
Yes,
Yes, absolutely. This would go with the idea of the life and death drives, which she took over from Freud. She took it and ran with it. She really liked it. It spoke to her. That she felt that there is something, the potential for us to be very, very loving and reparative and loving the other for themselves and not for any selfish motives. And there's also an inclination to be really hateful and destructive, and that we all carry these two drives. Absolutely. She said, well, we're stuck with this. This is being human.
But was she aware that in Judaism there are similar ideas?
I don't know if she was. It's very interesting. She may well have been, because I mean both her parents came from Orthodox backgrounds, although the mother's background was more liberal. She probably was. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's some more about that in the earlier part of the archive, because I've really looked at her clinical work, B, C, and D. I haven't looked at A very much, which is more family material. I might find more there.
We are near the end of our conversation, and there's one thing I wanted to ask you to talk about. Can you say something about the Kleinian movement today? I mean, what about these tribal wars that were between Anna Freud and the Kleinians? What is the situation today?
I mean, I don't know what my colleague Chris Mawson, who's also in the seminar today, would think, but I feel that we've all grown up a bit, and I feel we're much more respectful of each other on the whole than we were, and I think we've learned a huge amount from each other. And it is tribal. I mean, I was told when I walked into the Institute of Psychoanalysis for the first time as a complete newbie, who's your analyst? I said, Ronald Britton. They said, oh, you're a Kleinian then. You believe in the death instinct. And I said, what's that? What's the Kleinian? What's the death instinct? You're sort of identified as, that's your tribe. That's what you're supposed to believe in. And so we all have to overcome that in a way and discover what we do believe and what makes sense to us. But I think there's much more mutual, but there also, I think, as is always the case, under stress, we will split again into our factions and start fighting each other in a more tribal way. If people are sort of arguing about something to do with the structure of the society or the structure of committees, or, is this committee represented enough? Are there enough contemporary Freudians, are there enough independents, are there enough Kleinians on this committee? People will argue over tribal loyalties, but you know, when we're just working and seeing patients and discussing clinical work, we usually get on very well and don't think too much about the tribes. It's sort of, and we discover that we're seeing more or less the same phenomena. We have different languages to describe them. So it sort of comes and goes, tribalism, as it does in all human societies, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Jane Milton.
Thank you for having me.
We recommend very much the book and visiting the archives. They are fantastic.
Oh, and the website too. Have a look at the Melanie Klein Trust website.
The website of the archives.
The website of the Melanie Klein Trust. There's a link there to the archives.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to my blog. But thank you so much for having me. It's been a very interesting evening.
Thank you for being with us.